Mr. Daniel Jackson. 3 years ago, he joined the Fellowship of Free Thought. For the first time, he found a large group of like-minded people who accepted him as family and shared his desire to believe as many true things and reject as many false things as possible. Daniel does not have formal training in theology, astrophysics, or biology, but that does not stop him from exploring these topics rigorously in his pursuit of truth. Daniel is an extremely active Facebook debater. Let me just introduce this briefly. This is not here. One of the things I commonly find is what I would call rabid social media Rottweilers that when you get them in person become toothless chihuahuas. I don't suspect that of Mr. Jackson. So, yeah, I greatly respect and appreciate Daniel's interaction, and that's why he's here and I invited him. Facebook debater, a guest columnist for the Atheist Republic website, and in his free time enjoys weightlifting, rollerblading, chess, and spending time with his wife, Sarah, and their two dogs, Kevin and Lauren. We got to discuss your dog names. This is his first formal debate. Give the loudest welcome you possibly can. Discussing Is the Universe Designed? Mr. Daniel Jackson.
Everybody, thanks for making it out on a Game of Thrones night. Really appreciate that. Before I get rolling, I want to definitely give praise to the Bible Beer Consortium. These events are just amazing. You know, when I first heard that there were religious debates happening just a few blocks from my house, it's weird, but I got pretty excited. See, as a kid growing up in small-town Texas, atheism wasn't even an option. I didn't even know what that was until I got to college. But that stopped me from asking a bunch of really annoying questions about the logic of it all. I was a very analytical kid. Unfortunately, while I was asking all these questions, the answers I kept getting were not very satisfying. In fact, they tended to be more along the lines of this. Choose faith in spite of the facts. Joel Osteen said that. As you can imagine, for my logical brain, these kinds of answers were tough to take. And after a while, my faith was eventually dwindled down to that sub-basement level called, it must just work out somehow. 5 years ago, when I realized I was an atheist, all of that passion that I had as a kid suddenly reignited. I began watching every debate I could find on YouTube, and in fact now, I have trouble finding ones I haven't already seen. I've been itching to try my hands at one of these for a long time, so I've got to give thanks to Ezra for personally inviting me to participate here tonight. And definitely I have to thank Dr. Miller. He knows nothing about me, so to debate me tonight takes a lot of courage, so thank you. But most of all, I need to thank you out there. To know that there are other people out there pondering these questions the way that I do, it's really invigorating to me. It reminds me that these questions are not just for astrophysicists and biblical scholars. These questions are for all of us as we try to figure out our place in reality. The question in particular is the universe designed? That question has been asked for centuries. We have all heard the common arguments already. From the affirmative side, we may expect to hear about the finely tuned constants and the initial conditions of the Big Bang. We may expect to hear about Bayesian probabilities and the likelihood principle. In fact, Dr. Miller may recognize that paragraph on the right because I stole it from his blog. We may expect to hear that if we were to change the force of gravity by 1 over a billion zeros, the universe would have never been here. From my side, you may expect to hear about the theoretical multiverse. Or I could tell you about how 99.99997% of the universe would kill us instantly. I could talk about how the universe has been around for 13.7 some odd billion years before we even got here. These arguments all have their place, and I'm going to be talking on some of them a bit later. But since we're still talking about this question, maybe we need a slightly different approach. Now, I'm willing to bet that within each and every one of you, regardless of which side you're on, there is a voice inside called skepticism. For some of us, it is a deafening lion's roar. And for others, maybe it's more of a mouse's whisper. But we have a skeptical voice. So tonight, I want to speak to the skeptic voice inside each and every one of you. I want to explain why your skeptic voice has something to say about this question, and even more importantly, why you should listen to it. And in case you're wondering what this even if means down here in the corner, as I was preparing for this debate, I noticed a trend start to form. So I thought it would be fun to keep track of how many times I said the words even if. And it'll make sense to you as we go along, but for now, I'll just show you how it works. So as an example, even if my lovely wife, Sarah, were only half as beautiful as she is, marrying her still would have been the easiest decision I ever made. There it goes, it went up. So we'll reset the counter and we'll get started. Is the universe designed? Well, this is a pretty tricky question. And by tricky, I mean there are actually tricks in the question. The first trick is in the word universe. So when someone says or asks if something is designed, they are taking for granted that that thing that we're talking about is an everyday object that we're familiar with, we can relate to, we can conceptualize, something like that. For example, is this watch designed? Or is that car designed? See, these are valid questions. We're all familiar with watches and cars. We can measure them, they have properties. And more importantly, we are able to clearly distinguish the difference between watch and not watch, which is something we absolutely must be able to do before we can dive into the deeper details. Unfortunately, the universe is not so easily discernible. Now, we've all heard that the universe is around 14 billion years old and about 93 billion light years across. But those numbers should actually have the words "at least" in front of them, because when scientists put numbers around, they're actually talking about the observable universe. That's only as far as we can see. Beyond that boundary, we have no idea what's going on. We don't know how far it goes or how long it's been there. Cats and dogs could be living together, who knows? We will never know what's going on out there. So, is it really fair to reduce all of this, 99% of which is a total mystery to us, down to something as simple as a watch and start asking questions? My skeptic voice says no. But I really do like analogies, though, and I was tempted to try to draw an analogy to the universe, but I couldn't do it. So instead of ditching all of that mystery and all of that unknown and shrinking this down to a watch, why don't instead we adjust the watch to make it more comparable to the universe? So, for example, we don't know where the universe begins or ends. And in fact, if we were to look at a not universe, we wouldn't know what we were looking at. So let's do the same thing to the watch and see what happens. Now, how long do you think that conversation is going to last? To be fair, this isn't really a perfect analogy. Given what we don't know about the universe, this whole screen should actually be black. The truth is that as far as the universe is concerned, we know so little about it. It's just this one-of-a-kind thingamajig whatchamacallit that we have no business comparing to anything else. But that's what this question requires us to do. Now, this should be enough to just put this question to bed, but I'm going to keep going anyway, because even if the universe was just a regular old object, there's still that second trick in this question. It's in the word designed. Now, as far as I know, and Dr. Miller can correct me if I'm wrong, there are 3 ways to assess the designedness of an object. The first way is to actually observe the object being designed in real time. Unfortunately, the universe was around long before we got here, so direct observation is out. The second way is to go to the dictionary, which is kind of boring, but the dictionary says that something is designed if it exhibits intention or purpose. Now, I think if we were all to write down how to determine that an object was intentional, we'd probably come up with quite a few different answers. It's a pretty subjective enterprise, but that's not to say we should throw that out entirely. It's just not very empirical, so we're going to come back to that a little bit later. The third way is the way that is probably most familiar to all of us. It's how we work in day-to-day life. Look at an object and say, well, duh, that was obviously intentional. There's just no point in arguing. And I completely agree with that. So take Mount Rushmore, for example. I'm sure we can all agree that anything displaying something as unique as a face must have been intentional. Okay, well, maybe there are a few exceptions, but we'll get back to the mountain here. Like I was saying, anything displaying a human face must have been intentional. But why can we look at this picture and so easily say, well, of course, that was intended to look like that? It's kind of a weird question, but I'm going to offer an answer. We're able to look at this picture and say, yes, that was intentional, because we consider things intentional when they don't occur naturally. Now, that's very important, so I'm going to repeat that. We consider things intentional or designed when they don't occur naturally. Watches simply don't appear on beaches all by themselves. Cars don't get built in junkyards naturally. And faces, well, don't appear on mountains naturally. Wouldn't that be something, though, if faces just randomly started showing up on mountains all by themselves, begging our pattern-seeking brains to come up with reasons for why they're there? That would be something. In fact, I bet those of us with a mouse's whisper of a skeptic voice might come up with a supernatural explanation. But we are now at the crux of this second trick. The universe is, for all intents and purposes, nature itself. And nature, by the very word, is naturally occurring. We call things designed when they are not naturally occurring. So do you see the trick? Isn't it a logical contradiction to suddenly say that nature, naturally occurring, is designed? When I was rehearsing this debate for my dog, Kevin, he showed me his skeptic face when I got to this point, so I thought I'd share it with you. As soon as we start calling nature itself designed, the word design loses all meaning. So it's not something we can really do. Now, this should be enough to wrap up the argument, but I'm going to keep going anyway, because even if the universe was just a regular old object, and even if we could assess the designedness of nature itself, are we able to come up with a logical answer? For this section, I'm going to go over some of the common design arguments and show you where the flaws are. They all have flaws. The one that we have probably heard the most is called the fine-tuning argument. For those of you unfamiliar, the fine-tuning argument states that all of our physical constants, like the force of gravity, the speed of light, the strong and weak force, and so on, if they were different by just the teeniest amount, then the universe would have imploded or exploded or not be here at all, or who knows. Poof. Now, as you have guessed, based on the theme of my presentation, there are some tricks here that they are hoping we don't look at. So join me and let's stare right at them. When somebody says that if a constant were different by the teeniest amount, they're asking you to assume that constant could be different in the first place. It's a pretty big assumption. Could the force of gravity be any different? I mean, sure, it can feel different depending on what planet you're on, but the force itself has never been any different from the time that we started measuring. What about the speed of light? Once again, since we started measuring light, we have never detected it to be any faster or slower than 186,000 miles per second. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that our constants absolutely cannot be different. That would be dishonest. But what I can tell you is that since we have been doing science and measuring these things, we have never collected any evidence or established any reason to believe that they could be any different. Now, this should be enough to wrap up the fine-tuning argument, but I'm going to keep going anyway, because even if the constants could be different, there is another trick in here. Whenever anybody says that the universe would behave this way or that way, they are relying on the output of a mathematical model or a computer simulation that we have constructed. We have looked out into the universe and collected as much information as we could, and we put it all together into a computer simulation, and then the results behaved a lot like what we see outside. That's how we knew we were on the right track. But is it really fair to start tweaking the fundamental building blocks of these models and then continue to trust the output? Once again, my skeptical voice says no. To do that demonstrates a vast overestimation of our current understanding of reality. And I'll give you an example of how this works. Back in the early 1800s, there were two processes called electricity and magnetism. And back then, we thought they were two completely independent phenomena, totally unrelated to each other. So somebody could have come along and made this exact same argument. They could have said, hey, if we tweak electricity just a little bit, then our models say the universe would blow up. That is until, of course, Maxwell came along with his famous equations, and he showed us that electricity and magnetism were two sides of the same coin. Because of him, most of us had to suffer through that annoying class called electromagnetism. Sometimes finding these connections is not very easy. In fact, Einstein was made famous. He figured out how to find the connection between space and time, and that's why we call it space-time. But I still have a hard time wrapping my brain around that one. And the connections that are coming in the future are even going to be more difficult to find. The search continues for that grand unified theory of everything. But until we figure that out, until we have 100% confidence that the constants are exactly why they are for this reason, and as soon as we understand all of the relationships between them, we have no business manipulating this one or that one in incomplete models, then drawing conclusions based on the result. I'm going to show you a couple other design arguments here. A couple months back on Facebook, I was in a discussion with an apologist named Nancy Piercy. Nancy has 5 apologetic books. She's also a fellow of the Discovery Institute, which is the center of the design movement. In that conversation, Nancy quoted herself from her own book to me, and she said, "The amazing fit of mathematical concepts to the physical world cries out for an explanation. But without the assumption of a divine creator, there is no explanation." I've heard this argument made quite a bit more times than I think is right. Because the only thing that cries out to me here, actually it's my skeptic voice, is no way! This cannot be a valid argument. Mathematics is not some standalone construct independent of reality. We developed mathematics. It is an abstract representation of reality that we have laid on top of things so that experiments on paper rather than counting sticks all day. As soon as we learn more about reality, we also have to change our math. As soon as we discovered quantum particles, we had to invent brand new mathematics to represent quantum mechanics. Another common argument like this one comes from I forgot this part. Nancy's argument is kind of like going into a tailor and being measured for a shirt, and then marveling at how well it fits. Another argument comes from a man named John Lennox, who's actually a professor at Oxford, which is where Dr. Miller's from. John is a mathematician, and he's very active on the debate circuit, and he said, "Physics is powerless to explain its faith in the intelligence of the universe, because you have to accept this before you even do any physics. You've got to believe science can be done before you can do it. You have to believe the rational intelligibility of the universe." Once again, my skeptic lion goes, "Roar!" Rationality and intelligibility are not some standalone concept apart from the universe. Our universe defines for us what rational behavior is. Now, some people struggle with this, so I'll give you an example. Suppose in this universe and on this planet, we were to hold an apple and then drop it. But instead of falling to the floor, it fell to the ceiling. We would probably call this a miracle. Irrational behavior. But that's only because we live in a universe where things fall to the ceiling is not what happens every day. That is the irrational behavior. If we lived in a universe where gravity was repulsive, then falling up would be rational and falling down would be irrational. So it's really no surprise that we expect the universe to continue behaving exactly as it has always done. In fact, I would say that if the universe started misbehaving, that would be the essence of a designer. Now, I want to show you one more simple presentation of the fine-tuning argument, because I feel like this one best represents the mistake that every design argument makes, that I can tell. We've all seen this sentence before. If the constants were any different, life... Well, let's take a look at exactly what kind of manipulation they're doing to us here. In the first half of the sentence, if the constants were any different, they are asking us to expand the range of all possible values for our constants to such a large set that they happen to be exactly where they landed must have been intentional. Okay, fine. Then in the second half of the sentence, we are asked to reduce the range of all possible configurations for life down to just one, ours, making it so special that it must have been intentional. Now, my skeptic voice has a real big problem with this kind of inconsistency, and I hope yours does too. About it. If they were consistent and they applied all possibilities to both sides or one possibility to both sides, then the fine-tuning argument would fall on its face. Now, this should be enough to wrap up all of this, but I'm going to keep going anyway, because even if the universe was just a regular old thing, and even if we could the designedness of nature itself, and even if we could come up with this question, what would we come up with? Well, now we get to go back to the dictionary definition. As a reminder, something is designed with its intention or purpose. Now, this part is really just an opinion. So I'm going to give you a sales pitch, and I'm going to ask you to just try to be as honest as you can. A lot of people on the believing side like to claim that the universe was put here just for us. So let's talk about that as an actual purpose for a little while. Here's a calendar. It's okay if you can't see it. Here's a calendar representing the entire lifespan of our universe, condensed down to a single year. If you enjoyed with me, you probably recognize this. So according to this calendar, on January 1st, the Big Bang happened. And right now, it is December 31st, 2359, 999, 999. So in this calendar, our solar system started to form around September. Now, that's kind of hard to relate to, so we'll get a little more. We all learned from Jurassic Park that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. In this calendar, that was yesterday. Homo sapiens, our original genetic ancestors, first started walking around 6 months ago. And the Old Testament, which religions around the world are based on, was written 6 seconds ago. Now, I ask this question with as much respect as I can muster here. How unbelievably arrogant must you be to think that an entire year took place just for the benefit of the last 6 seconds? And that's just time, folks. That's just time. Now I'm going to talk to you about space. I love talking about the size of space. It is so incomprehensibly big. Now, this picture here represents our spiral Milky Way galaxy. You're probably wondering what this yellow circle here represents. If you think that that is our solar system, then you vastly overestimate our place in the universe. That yellow circle represents everything that you can see with your eyes when you step outside and look up. I'm talking about the Big Dipper, Orion and his slimming belt, Cassiopeia. In fact, the entire zodiac sign is found in that circle. And just look at how big our Milky Way galaxy is compared to that. So, how far away is the edge of the universe? Well, in order to show you this, we're going to have to do some resizing. So we're going to take that Milky Way galaxy down to the size of something we're all familiar with, a penny. This penny that I'm holding up represents our Milky Way galaxy, which means that everything you can see outside is covered by Honest Abe's eyeball, pretty much. So how far away is the edge of the universe? Cowboy Stadium, that way. 20 miles away in Arlington, Texas. Folks, our galaxy isn't even a pixel on this image. And what you can see outside, all of that, it is even a fraction of that not even a pixel. Can you really honestly believe that all of that was created just for us? And while you're chewing on that question, keep in mind that that's just the edge of the observable universe. That's as far as we can see. Remember this slide? We don't know how much further it goes. Can you really believe that all of that was created for us? And while you're chewing on that, also remember that 99% of that kills us instantly. And while your skeptic voice is screaming about that one, also remember that the universe will continue doing what it has always done until it will reach a final state. Some candidates for that final state. It could wind up in the big freeze or heat death. Sounds fun. Or the big crunch. Or the big rip. Is it really possible that this universe was designed to wind up in the big rip? I'll let you think about that. I'm going to leave you with a final thought now. We are all children of this universe. Everything you have ever dreamed, thought of, imagined, speculated on, even rationalized, it's all part of this universe. Even if you try to imagine what another universe would be like, all you're doing is taking something you know about this universe and tweaking it. So it's limited. We are time-bound, space-bound entities. So whenever somebody comes up you and starts trying to tell you about something they couldn't possibly comprehend, say no. You could comprehend something like that. When somebody comes up to you and starts trying to make claims that they couldn't possibly know, stop them. Ask questions. Ask more questions. If the answers you get are not clear, ask for clarification. Don't let them off the hook until either your inner skeptic is fully satisfied or you hear those three beautiful words, I don't know. Because folks, you can totally disregard all of the problems that I've shown you here tonight, and even after all that, the only answer that is true for this question right now is I don't know. Skepticism is not your enemy. Skepticism should be your best friend. It is simply a pathway to the truth, and it is a safe pathway. Along the way, it will protect you from calling a psychic or sending money to a Nigerian prince. And folks, I promise you, even if it turns out there is some divine, all-powerful being that created everything, even though he clearly works very mysteriously and inefficiently, skepticism will get you to that truth too. So be safe and be skeptical. Thank you very much.
Daniel Jackson. Next speaker. Dr. Calum Miller is a doctor working in Manchester, England, having graduated from the University of Oxford in 2015. He's published a number of papers in academic philosophy journals and writes for various newspapers, including The Telegraph and The Huffington Post. He loves traveling, dancing, and the state of Texas, despite his questionable baseball cap. As they prepare, I get to add to his bio. He's also written songs for Jay-Z. Now, Calum debated with Dr. Zach Moore a year ago, roughly in Fort Worth. And was a very, very cordial individual. I think initially I thought he looked as if he wasn't old enough to get into the bar. I know, I'm judging. Forgive me. But he has the advantage of the fact that anyone that speaks with a British accent can read a cereal box, and you just fall on the ground with how brilliant it sounds. Yes, you know what I'm saying. In contrast to those that speak from Georgia, and they could be redefining the universe, and you would think they were idiots. And so, we continue. So Chris is still accepting tips from the bar? Yes. I think the Screamo bands next door are very confused with what's going on over here, as we have a larger crowd than them. But that's okay. That's why you're playing Screamo. And I think we're ready. Yes.
Can you hear me? Sound like it's great. Okay. We're ready to go?
Speaking to is the universe designed? The man amongst men, Dr. Kalam Miller.
So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for Ezra for putting this on again. Again, another great venue, another great audience, and I'm really glad you could all come out tonight. Like Dan said, on Game of Thrones night, I'm sure I will go straight back and watch it as soon as possible after I'm done. I feel like I've been at a bit of a disadvantage to come to Dallas to do these debates. So last year when I debated Zachary Moore, he spoke a little bit about his children. This time Dan spoke about his wife. I'm single and have a cat who hates me, who runs away every time he sees me. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I think the cutest thing about me is that I got really upset when Marco Rubio dropped out of the Republican race. And that's about as cute as it gets. So I'm sorry I can't have any more of those nice personal features about me, but you'll have to do with what I have to say tonight. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for Dan for debating with me tonight and for his presentation. He's put a lot of work into it and lots of really stimulating things to think about. And I'm hopefully going to be able to speak a little bit about them and respond to some of his concerns. I'm also really grateful that you guys, both last year and this year, have managed to accept me into God's own country, Texas, despite me clearly being a filthy redcoat who probably doesn't belong here at all. But I had some wonderful pork ribs earlier, and I ate the whole rack, so I feel like a true Texan after all. So I'm going to be obviously speaking about design. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, I'm going to be defending the idea that the universe is designed. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't be a very useful or interesting debate. So hopefully, we're going to crack on with it. There we go. OK, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about what evidence means, just so that we can get our heads around when something counts as evidence for a theory. I'm going to be advancing the theory that God exists, that God designed the universe. And so I want to just go through quickly some principles to help us understand how we can have evidence for that and what evidence for that claim might look like. So Colin Houston, a respected philosopher of science from the UK, says that to say that a body of information is evidence in favor of a hypothesis is to say that the hypothesis receives some degree of support or confirmation from that information. That's a very long-winded way of saying that something is evidence for a theory if it supports it or confirms the theory. That might seem fairly circular and not very interesting, so we can put it like this instead. Evidence for a theory is something which raises the probability of a theory. And once we put it in these terms, we can actually use probability theory. I'm not going to go into much detail on it, but we can use probability theory to understand when something is evidence for something else. And this is actually very helpful in terms of many religious debates and debates within science and various other fields. And if you do the probability, if you work out the mathematics, I'm not going to go through it in detail, you can show that evidence for a theory is which would be expected if a theory was true, but which wouldn't be expected if a theory was false. Evidence for a theory is something which would be expected if a theory was true, but which wouldn't be expected if a theory was false. There are some nuances to that which I'll try and go over. So just to give an illustrated example, this is theory 1. Theory 1 says that the world looks like this. I don't know if you can see the picture from up here. It's just a world atlas. I don't know what the country's colors represent. I assume by the fact that Russia's red means it just indicates corruptness or something. Against my theory there is that New York isn't red as well. And that Texas isn't green, obviously. Theory 2 says that the world looks like this. It looks completely different. So theory 1 is making a prediction and saying, if this theory is true, the world will look like this. Theory 2 is making another theory and making a prediction from that theory saying, if theory 2 is true, we'd expect to see this in the world. We'd expect to see everything yellow. Once we have those theories and their predictions, we look at the evidence. And the evidence says, actually, the world looks like this. And clearly, the common sense inference most of us would make is that this observation, this evidence, supports evidence for theory 2. And the reason is because if theory 2 is correct, it predicts that the world will look like this, and so it makes the prediction that we actually find. Theory 1 predicts something else. It predicts that the world will look different, and so it's not confirmed by that evidence. And so the observation in this case favors theory 2. Now, some further principles just to go through that. Is that the strength of the evidence for a theory depends on exactly how unlikely the evidence is otherwise. So if a theory says that, for example, if we're talking about a murder case, say that the theory is that someone with a gun, finding my fingerprints on a gun is very, very, very likely if I didn't actually touch the gun or anything like that. So if we did find my fingerprints on a gun, that would be very strong evidence that I used it. In other cases, certain observations fairly likely either way, and so they're not very strong evidence either way. But if something is really unlikely if a theory is false, then that's very strong evidence in typical cases. A second further principle is just to say that simply offering alternative theories doesn't necessarily undermine the evidential force of a piece of evidence. So, for example, if I point to the fact that we found my fingerprints on a gun and say, look, this is good evidence that I touched the gun, if someone comes along and says, look, there's another theory which can explain this, we could say that someone with your fingerprints, you have an identical twin who has the same fingerprints because of the same uterine and gestational events. They have your same fingerprints and they touched the gun. That doesn't necessarily do anything to undermine the fact that this is clearly evidence that I touched the gun. So simply offering alternative hypotheses on its own isn't enough to undermine a piece of evidence. Dan obviously correctly understood what I was going to say, correctly predicted what I was going to say. I'm going to be talking about two main arguments. There are many arguments for God's existence, and I think they all work together to have a cumulative impact, but I'm focusing on just two, which are the two of the typical design arguments to keep it predictable and safe. And the first of these is the fine-tuning argument, which Dan talked about, and the second of these is order of the universe. So the fine-tuning argument Dan's already explained. It basically says that the universe had to be fine-tuned in order to allow life to exist. And there are a number of different ways that the universe is. There are a number of different modes. So one of them, for example, is the constants in the laws of physics, which Dan talked about. I'm going to be talking briefly about those. Another is the initial conditions of the universe. Even apart from the constants in the laws of physics, the initial conditions of the universe had to be a very specific way to allow life to exist. This isn't some crackpot theory which I've just made up or said without any evidence or any professional backing. This is Martin Rees, who's one of the top astronomers at Cambridge University, and he says the outcome of the universe depended crucially on a recipe encoded in the Big Bang, and this recipe seems to have been rather special. A degree of fine-tuning in the expansion speed, the material content of the universe, and the strengths of the basic forces, things like gravity and electromagnetism, seems to have been a prerequisite for the emergence of the hospitable cosmic habitat in which we live. And Paul Davies, another very well-respected physicist who also spent time at Cambridge, again, not a Christian or anything like that, says there is now broad agreement among physicists that the universe is in several respects finely tuned for life. So I mentioned that there are at least two types of fine-tuning of constants and fine-tuning of the initial conditions. To briefly go over the fine-tuning of the constants, there are a number of different constants in the laws of physics. I'm not going to go into detail about them. Most people find that sort of thing very boring, but we're going to take just one example in this case, the strength of gravity. I think it's a fairly familiar one. Most of us have used gravity in various forms for various reasons, and it's one we're very familiar with. The strength of gravity is to do with how much things attract each other. Anything with a mass will attract each other. Things with bigger masses will attract each other more. Things closer to each other will attract each other more. And that's basically how gravity works for a fairly simplistic understanding. Now, if the strength of gravity was smaller or larger, Robert Collins says, by an estimated 1 part in 10 to the power of 60 of its current value, the universe would have either exploded too quickly for galaxies and stars to form, or collapsed back on itself too quickly for life to evolve. So although the strength of gravity doesn't seem to make any huge material difference in our day-to-day lives, and if it was a tiny bit greater or a tiny bit weaker, it probably wouldn't seem to make much difference to us. When the universe was initially exploding from a tiny singularity, the force of gravity was absolutely crucial. And what Robin Collins is saying here is that if it was smaller by the tiniest amount, if it was just a tiny bit weaker, the universe would never have held itself together. It would have just completely exploded and nothing would have ever existed in terms of life or material complexity. On the other hand, if gravity was the tiniest bit stronger, everything would have crunched together, everything would have been drawn together too much in that initial state of the universe for any universe to form which would support any kind of material life. So that's just one example. Roger Penrose from Oxford University is a physicist, a theoretical physicist. He talks about the initial conditions of the universe. And he says that the initial conditions had to be incredibly special in a particular way. So he says, in order to produce a universe resembling the one in which we live, the creator, I'm not sure if he actually believes in one, I does, or at least doesn't believe in a traditional religious one, the creator would have to aim for an absurdly tiny volume of the phase space of possible universes. I won't go into detail with the physics. It's to do with entropy and the low state at the beginning of the universe. But the point is that he's saying the initial conditions were so extremely special and unlikely that the chances of it arising, if you look at all the possibilities, are 1 in every 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123, which just for illustration is 10 to the power of that number, which is obviously absolutely huge and fairly incomprehensible. But that's the magnitude of the fine-tuning that we're talking about, that we have in mind. So the argument goes like this. If there was no God and we looked at all the possibilities, the number of possibilities which allow a universe to permit life, to permit the material complexity that we need for life, those possibilities are an extremely small proportion of all the total possibilities. So if there was no God, we wouldn't expect the universe to be life-permitting. But if, on the other hand, God did exist, we would expect the universe to be life-permitting. And that's because God, by definition, is a loving, morally perfect, omnipotent, omniscient creator, and morally perfect, loving beings thrive on relationships, and they crave relationships, and they are all about relationships and sharing their love. And in that case, we would expect God to make life. We'd expect God to make a universe that allowed life to exist so that he could share his life, so that he could be in relationship with his creatures. So if God exists, the fact that we live in a life-permitting universe isn't surprising at all. It's to be expected. So the evidence of a life-permitting universe is evidence for God. The second argument, the order of the universe. Science makes assumptions in order to work. So typically when we do scientific practice, we generally assume that the future will be relevantly like the past. We assume that as the sun comes up every day in the past, it will continue to come up tomorrow, and so on. The universe has regular laws, in other words, and these laws can be kind of generic ones that we found out right at the beginning of civilization, like the sun coming up every day, or it can be more complex ones, like Newton's laws of physics. Or Einstein's law of special relativity, for example. David Hume, several centuries ago, pointed out a problem with this. He says, all inferences from experience are based on the assumption that the future will resemble the past. But as soon as the suspicion is planted that the course of nature may change, so that the past stops being a guide to the future, all experience becomes useless and can't support any inference or conclusion. What he's saying is, if we think about the possibility that the future won't resemble the past, there's actually no good reason, so far as Hume can see, to think that the future will be like the past. Once we think about that suspicion, once we think about that idea, we can't really come up with many good reasons to think that the future will be like the past. Now, David Hume wasn't a particularly religious man, and so he excluded the possibility that God might be a good reason to think that the future will be like the past. But this intuition that Hume has is widely shared, I think, among many philosophers. So Norman Swartz, again, not a religious philosopher, says, large-scale coincidences, and he's talking about the coincidences of the laws of nature, that they're perfectly regular. They cry out for explanations that reveal the contrivance, planning, or deliberation behind the phenomenon. There are probably more than 10 to the power of 60 electrons in the universe, and all of them, we may suppose, have exactly the same electrical charge. Now, although I'm prepared to accept that 5 red cars in a row might be dismissed as a coincidence, can I allow that 10 to the power of 60 items with precisely the same electrical charge is likewise? One thing we might do is swallow deeply and say nothing at all accounts for this fact. But faced with the prospect of having to say this, many persons find the sheer contingency of the actual world utterly fantastic. If it wasn't God, Swartz doesn't think it is God, if it wasn't God who designed all this and saw to it that all these countless particles are qualitatively identical, then something has to count for it. That 10 to the power of 60 things should all be alike in their properties cannot rationally be deemed just a coincidence. So the regularity of the universe isn't just something we should accept and that we should say that's not surprising at all. The fact that there is this extreme coincidence, the absolute regularity of so many laws over the entire period of the universe is something we have to think is actually fairly fantastic. My opinion is that if there's no God, if atheism is true, then we don't have an explanation for this. And this opinion is shared by people like David Hume. He doesn't come up with an alternative explanation. There are very good alternative explanations for this regularity. But again, if God existed, we would expect science to be possible. And that's because science is good. It's good for us to have scientific knowledge and to improve our knowledge about the world with science. It's also for another reason, that if we want to act towards each other, if I want to give someone a present, for example, to help please them, I have to know that me doing a particular action will result in them being happy, or is at least likely to result in them being happy. Or on the other hand, if I want to poison someone, if I want to hurt someone, I have to know how the world is going to work. I have to know that moving my hand in this way and giving them this mushroom is going to poison them, and so on. We need regularity and we need predictability in the future in order to have any kind of moral action available to us, in order to have any kind of meaningful relationships. And since that's the kind of thing that God would want his humans to have, he would want humans to have meaningful relationships with himself and with other people. If God existed, the regularity in the laws of physics is not surprising at all. And so again, I think the possibility of science and the regularity of the laws of nature is evidence for God. So just briefly to summarize, if we go back to our schematic at the beginning, we're going to use the same pictures, but we're going to be talking about the evidence that I've laid out briefly tonight. So the first theory we have here is that God exists. We're saying that if God exists, we'd expect the world to be a certain way. Namely, we'd expect it to exist and we'd expect it to have life. If God doesn't exist, as I mentioned before, we wouldn't expect gravity to be the right force. We wouldn't expect all the other laws of physics to be the way they are. And so we wouldn't expect the universe to exist in any way like this at all. So the fact that we do observe a life-permitting universe is evidence for God. Similarly, if God exists, we expect the universe to be ordered and regular so that we can predict the consequences of our actions. If God doesn't exist, we would expect chaos, because that's by far the most possibilities that could happen. And that's by far the amount of permutations, the way the world could have been arranged, is chaotic. And so again, the fact that we find an ordered, regular universe with all these coincidences put together is evidence for God. And so, in summary, I think there is compelling evidence for the existence of God, and I invite Daniel to respond to it as he wishes. Thank you very much.
Daniel Jackson will present now a 5-minute rebuttal.
Is this working? Yep, okay. Well, I feel like at least half of my rebuttal is part of my opening statement, so I guess I'll restate some of those things. One thing that we heard, I need to get this out of the way. He started by saying that he was deeply upset when Marco Rubio dropped out, and I personally didn't mind, so at least as far as rebuttal goes, we got that out of the way. I had mentioned in my opening statement that the thing that every design argument does is manipulate what we do know and what we don't know. And just to be honest, that's all I really heard in Dr. Miller's presentation. For example, we heard a couple different times. He said that if there was no God, we would expect the universe to be this. Why? I don't understand that connection at all. In order to say that you expect something means that you need to know a little something about it. But we only know about the universe. That's our universe. And whether there is or there isn't a God, all we know is our universe. So kind of like in my presentation, I said, what business do we have to start changing things around in our universe and then continue to draw conclusions from the new results? I don't see how we can expect anything with or without a God. Another thing that Dr. Miller liked to do was consider the constants again. He said, if the constants were different by this much or this much, then everything would be chaos or the universe wouldn't be here. But in the same presentation, he talked about how if the constants were any different, then life wouldn't exist at all. But like I said before, we're either considering all possibilities for the constants or just one possibility for life. But you can't do both. In fact, I'll go back to Jurassic Park, one of my favorite movies. We learned that life finds a way. So even if the constants were different, maybe life would figure that out too. Life is a very destructive force. One thing he mentioned was that we do expect the future to be like the past. And for some reason, this is evidence for God. I don't understand that one. But at the beginning, he did say that offering an alternative hypothesis without independent evidence did not undermine the evidence's force. I actually agree with this one. However, what happens if the same evidence that you're referring to suggests multiple hypotheses? then I think you're in a bit of a tricky problem. Because expecting the future to be just like the past is something that our brains, which we have evolved by watching the universe do what it does, our brains have figured that out. And it's only when things don't behave the way that they always have behaved that we are suddenly mystified and we have to figure out why that occurred. So to suddenly add a supernatural explanation to the universe behaving the way it always has seems like quite a reach. Sorry. Let's see. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention. I hear this argument made a lot. Dr. Miller likes to say, what are the odds that all of this occurred to create us? And, 10 to the 160th power or whatever. Well, I'll show you a little exercise on why this is a big old mathematical fallacy. What are the odds that we are all here tonight? For me, my parents had to meet. They had to get frisky. I'm not even going to go into all the permutations just to put me here tonight. And what about you? To put you here tonight. Your parents had to get together. You had to talk to a friend who was telling you about this debate. You were going to miss Game of Thrones, but you did anyway. What are the odds of all these things occurring? Well, they're astronomical. And yet, you were here. So is that a miracle? Well, anybody that has spent too much time in a casino like I have will know that if you watch the roulette wheel, eventually you will see some pretty crazy things happen. You will see 8 blacks in a row or 8 reds in a row. I've even seen 8 double zeros in a row. Took a picture of it. But when you're looking at things after the fact, assessing the probability of those events occurring doesn't mean anything because it happened. So you're pretty much just doing this big hand-waving argument to put a whole bunch of big numbers around something that actually occurred. Now, if you predicted it beforehand, then yes, that would be something. But to say all of that after the fact, I mean, if you ask me, you're pretty much just stretching to find a way to convince people that maybe there's something else out there beyond something we've never detected. So that's it for my rebuttal. Thank you.
5-minute rebuttal. Dr. Miller?
You still hear me? Is it on? Great. A lot to get through, obviously, in 5 minutes. I'm just going to try and rattle through the things that Dan said, try and get through as many as possible. I probably won't be able to address everything he said, but I'll do my best. One thing we have apparently decided, Ezra, is that the next BBC event clearly needs to be about exactly how upsetting it was that Marco Rubio dropped out of the Republican nomination field. So I'll be there next year for that. Dan talked a lot about the arguments that I gave, and like he said, he preempted some of these arguments in his opening speech, so I've got extra to respond to. Again, like I said, I'm just going to go through them as quickly as possible, but hopefully give you an idea of how I'd like to respond. When he talked about the fine-tuning argument, one of his main points was to say, know that the universe could have been any different. We're just assuming that the universe could have had different values for the constants and so on. It seems to me that if you made this sort of response, you could say it for literally any argument anyone makes for anything. So when we point to any for any theory at all, if we go back to the fingerprints on the gun theory, if I say, look, this evidence of fingerprints on a gun is clearly evidence that I used the gun, someone might pop up and say, well, how do you know that it could have been any other way? Maybe the fingerprints had to be on the gun. Maybe that's just the way the universe is. Maybe that was the only possibility for this universe. But clearly we accept that there are other possibilities, unless there's other reasons to think otherwise. And so Paul Davies, for example, talks about this when he talks about physicists modeling toy universes. He says the idea that saying this universe and the laws of physics are the only possible ones is nonsense because other physicists make toy universes with different laws of physics all the time. Another example, we pointed to the problem of evil. If Dan said, look, the evidence of evil in the world is evidence against God. If I just threw my hands up and said, well, that might be the only way the universe could possibly be, it seemed like a very good response. We want something better, I think. And so I think saying that the universe had to be this way or that we need proof of other possibilities is something that we need to entertain very seriously. When he talked about the argument from order, I talked about the argument saying that the massive coincidences in the universe, the fact that the universe behaves so regularly in such a huge number of ways all the time, I said this is an extremely incredible coincidence. Again, Dan said that this could be a chance, He says that unlikely things happen all the time. But if we revisit the structure of my argument, it wasn't just that something unlikely happened. There were two steps to my argument. The first is that something very unlikely happened if there is no God. That is nothing of interest in itself. But remember, the second step of my argument is the more crucial one, is that this is significantly more likely if there is a God, and therefore that it's very compelling evidence that there is a God. I think Dan hasn't fully taken on that part of the argument, and I think pointing out the fact that unlikely things happen on its own is obviously not of interest. But if one hypothesis says that evidence is really unlikely, but another hypothesis says that evidence is to be expected, if we actually find that incredibly unlikely chance evidence, we should go with the hypothesis that says it's to be expected, because that's the hypothesis which predicted it, and that's how science in general, I think, works. One of Dan's other points was to say that the sheer scale and magnitude of the universe, both in time and space, militates against my argument that it was God who orchestrated it all. I simply don't see why we should think that this is the case. For one thing, God doesn't need to do things efficiently in terms of time and space. He has a lot of it. So he doesn't need to do things as quickly as possible. He doesn't need to use as little space as possible. He can use as much as he likes. And I don't clearly see a reason why he shouldn't have done it with a huge time and a huge space. I just simply don't understand why God would need to use that sort of efficiency that Dan seems to assume that he needs to use. But more importantly, I don't think we need to see that this is a thing that undermines humans' place in the universe. My argument was never are the pride of the universe, the only important thing in the universe. They're just a very important part of it. And they're something that God would be likely to create. As my argument went, we would expect God to create a universe which allowed life. I didn't say we'd expect God necessarily to create a universe which was full of life or which had life at every single point in the universe. He'd expect one which allowed it. And that's, I think, the best we can say for the moment. But again, as my argument went, if God didn't exist, we wouldn't expect a universe which allowed life at all. We wouldn't expect an ordered universe at all. And so I can't see clearly which premise of the argument Stan is going against when he mentions this concern. I think the most important thing here, though, just to wrap up, is to say that in Christian theology, God isn't necessarily who wants to go through the easiest way of doing things. Christian theology has never said that God will use minimal time, minimal effort. Christian theology says that God put effort into the universe, he put time into the universe, he put space into the universe, but more importantly, he put himself into the universe, he put his vulnerability into the universe, and he put his son into the universe. And so I think in comparison with what Christianity says about Jesus on the cross and with what Christianity says about the sacrifices God makes for humanity and for a relationship with his creation, I think the fact of time and space are relatively small sacrifices compared to that. Thank you very much.
We will now transition to cross-examination. If both speakers will pull their chairs up to the center table here. Each presenter will be given 10 minutes to question the other directly. We will start with Daniel. 10 minutes. Mr. Jackson, please begin.
Well, I got my first question from a friend of mine. My friend Jeremy likes to start his dialogues with this question, so it's important to ask. Dr. Miller, if it turned out that we could figure out what is 100% the truth, but it actually went against your beliefs, would you still want to know about it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now we've established that, we can proceed. Okay. You have made a case that if we look out into the way the universe appears, we can draw evidence from it and conclude that God exists, or that the universe was designed, sorry. So will you please describe for us what an undesigned universe looks like?
Yes, so I think, as I was trying to suggest in my opening speech and in the later one, we can't say with certainty what an undesigned universe would be, but if we look at all the possibilities, and I think scientists do this all the time, they look at what the possibilities are and how the different ways the world could be. And they say, well, most of these possibilities involve some state of affairs. I think if we look at the possibilities for a universe that wasn't designed, we look at the possibilities for how strong gravity could be, for example, I think it would look fairly mundane. Gravity would likely be too strong or too weak, for example. That's just one aspect of what the universe would look like. But I don't think it would look anything like this. I don't think we'd have a universe that could allow material complexity. I think it would be a huge universe that didn't really have much in it, just gas or occasional neutrons and stuff, or it would be a tiny universe that couldn't support life.
So what do you base these possibilities on? What evidence or knowledge are you basing this information on?
So these are just looking at the possibilities in terms of manipulating these constants, for example, in the laws of physics, and running computer simulated models and saying, just manipulating it and using the computerized models to say, in these cases, looking at most of the cases, looking at all the cases where gravity is too weak, all the cases where gravity is too strong, and those make up most of the possibilities. And we say, the chances are, if the universe wasn't designed, then it would fall into one of those categories.
Well, I guess the point I'm trying to drive at is part of my opening statement. How do you know that there are other possibilities for the force of gravity, for example?
So I think in most of science, we talk about various possibilities for how things could have been. So when we talk about most experiments, they have a null hypothesis, which might be true, might not be true. They have a non-null hypothesis, which again might be true, might not be true. And they look at the various possibilities. They assume that most things are possible unless we can find a contradiction in them. And then they look at whichever the evidence militates against or militates in favor of.
Well, then let me just ask you this. Can our constants be different?
Yes, I think so.
Wow. You deserve a Nobel Prize when you can prove that.
I don't think we can change them, but I think they can be different.
Well, like I said, as soon as you can prove that, you'll get a Nobel Prize. I'm going to give you 3 scenarios. A vast universe in which every solar system has life, a single solar system universe that has life, or our own universe. Of these 3 scenarios, which do you think represents the greatest evidence for a fine-tuner?
Sorry, could you run through them again?
Sure. It's a vast universe in which every solar system has life,
Yeah.
a single solar system universe that has life, or our own universe.
I couldn't say, I don't think.
So you can say the constants can be different, but you can't pick a universe that would be evidence for a designer?
I think they'd all be fairly good evidence for a designer because they'd all be universes which permitted life, yeah.
Okay, so as long as life is permitted, that's proof that God exists.
I wouldn't say proof, I'd say it's very strong evidence because I think it's unlikely if God didn't exist, but to be expected if God did exist.
And then you did talk about how God doesn't care about space and time. But you also said that we would expect the universe to look like it does. But in my own opinion, I would think if life permitting is the key aspect of a universe being evidence, then wouldn't either of the first 2 scenarios, either a vast universe with every solar system full of life or just a single solar system universe, wouldn't both of those be better?
I think it's possible, but I don't think God, so I think God has a general moral obligation to create other creatures. I think God, we would expect if God existed that he'd create some creatures to fall in relationship, but I just don't see any reason to expect that the population density of the universe would be infinite or maximal. I think the population density of the universe can be whatever God likes. Otherwise, we could always say, why doesn't God create even more people? And there's kind of an infinite problem of why doesn't God just create more and more? I don't think God has that kind of obligation on him. I just think he has to create creatures that he can have relationship with, that can have relationship with each other. And I don't think he has any kind of responsibility for making as many as possible or spacing them out in equal ways or whatever.
Now, this actually wasn't a question that I wrote, but it's one that I like to ask a lot. You've just described a lot about what God wants or what God does, but none of what you said is in the Bible. So how can you speak for God in this case?
So I think in general, when we think about God, we can't just go from the Bible. I think it's important to have kind of independent evidence, and we need to have a reason to think that the Bible is true in the first place. And often that evidence is just going to come from theoretical reasoning, like we do in most of science. So in most of science, we think of theories and we say, under most likelihoods, what would happen if this theory was true? So we say, if Newton's theory of gravity is true, we'd probably expect the apple to fall from the tree. and that's something we can't necessarily prove. It doesn't logically entail that the apple falls from the tree, but it seems likely that if gravity is true, the apple will fall from the tree. And that's just something we have to think about on reflection and thinking about the theory. And when we think about the theory that God exists, we have to think about what that theory entails or what that theory predicts or suggests. And I'm suggesting that given the theory says that there's a God who is omnipotent, is omniscient, and a God who is morally perfect, I think when we analyze the concept of moral perfection, that involves real obligations to other relational beings. It involves being someone who can look after and love and have compassion on other people. And that obviously requires other people to exist. And so I think that would be a good reason for expecting a God to make other people.
Well, I do find it interesting that when scientists do these thought experiments, the scientists that don't believe in God never actually find God in their thought experiments, but the ones who start out believing in God tend to find God. But anyway, I'll move on. Is there anything that you wish were different about our universe that would make your argument stronger?
If I had to pick one thing that was different about universe, Marco Rubio would be the nominee.
He was a funny guy, I'll admit.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. I think it would be dishonest to say that this universe is exactly what I expect if God didn't exist. If God existed, I think Christians shouldn't say, yeah, universe is exactly what we'd expect. How convenient? Because I don't think it is. I think some things are difficult to explain and count as some evidence against God. So, for example, I think certain forms of suffering or certain forms of the fact that God doesn't make himself known to what I think are sincere people, I think those are difficult challenges and they constitute some evidence against God. I think it would be dishonest of me to say that they wouldn't, this universe is exactly what I'd expect.
Good.
So, yeah.
All right, well, I have one last question. It's kind of a long one, though. Demon possession is now recognized as epilepsy. God's wrath in the form of earthquakes are now recognized as shifts in the tectonic plates. God's power in the form of life diversity is now recognized as evolution by natural selection. And God's punishment in the form of illness is now recognized as germs and viruses. Given this extremely unsuccessful track record of supernatural explanation, how confident are you that your supernatural designer theory will survive the test of time?
So this is actually a question that I was really challenged by for a long time. I think it's a very good one. And I think Christians have to think seriously about this kind of, these past successes of science and the past failures of theology and explain why they think that the current suggestions of theology are going to be ones that aren't just superseded by science. I think it's a very good question. I think there are kind of two broad aspects to it. One is looking at the science and saying that actually science hasn't been as successful in coming up with true theories right from the start as some people suggest. So science is always superseding itself. Even the most secure of theories, things like Newton's laws of physics, these were superseded several decades ago by Einstein's theories. And so it's very likely, I think, in the future that we'll revise them again and again. And I don't think science necessarily has got it right from the start. So that's one part of the answer. The second part, I think, is that when you look at the fundamental areas of theology, I think things like demon possession, things like earthquakes being caused by God, firstly, I'd say that if we're being very technical, some of them are still compatible if we take a view of God where he puts the laws of nature in operation. But that's not the most important point, I think. I think the most important point is to say that these kinds of areas are typically very peripheral areas of theology. And the areas which Christians have always held right from the start, which haven't been explained, things that Christians have said for centuries haven't been explained, those have always been the stronger arguments, I think, and those are the ones where the arguments haven't really been undermined. So Christians have always pointed to, for example, the fact that the universe is beautiful, that the universe is ordered in particular ways, and they've always pointed to the historical evidence about Jesus and what he said and what he did in his ostensible resurrection. And in those areas, the most central areas of theology and the areas where Christians have always said that there's an argument from here to God, those areas I don't think science has really made any progress on. And if anything, they've shown through these recent advances in fine-tuning, for example, that... Sorry, as we're distracting me. I think some of these examples, Christians have actually had more evidence come from science, like with fine-tuning, which has come through in the last few decades.
Can I ask one more question? Do I got time?
Because I like you, yes.
So you mentioned beauty as an example. And some of the other things you mentioned also kind of struck a chord with me as being fairly opinionated. Now, my wife, Sarah, she sees so much beauty in plants and vegetarian meals, and I don't see that at all. But what I'm trying to say is that beauty is very much in the eye of the beholder. It's a very subjective opinion. In fact, somebody suggested a question to me. I think it was Zach, actually. He said, "Isn't there beauty in watching dust just float in a light beam?" But that's clearly not evidence of a designer. So when you talk about these things that are actually very subjective and can change from person to person, how can you rely on those things as being empirical evidence?
Yeah, so I don't think beauty is one of the strongest arguments for God's existence.
His mic is...
Hello?
The mic's not on.
Hello? Can you hear me? Nope.
You want to take mine?
This is becoming surprisingly intimate. We are friends, it's fine. I agree. I don't think beauty is one of the strongest arguments for God's existence. I just gave that as an example of something that Christians have said from an early point. I think my more general point was that these more central arguments, and I just threw out beauty as an example, these have been ones that Christians have held to be more important and have held since the beginning. And on those more central ones, I don't think science has made much progress in undermining those arguments, and sometimes it's made progress in supporting those arguments. So the argument from beauty, I wouldn't pin too much on that. I'm not making this claim that this is another great argument that is insuperable and so on. I'm just saying these arguments, I think, haven't really been undermined by science despite several millennia of working on them. Is this on now?
Yeah, it's on now.
I think Daniel just took away my microphone so we could cuddle for a bit.
It's a game move. Testing.
Okay, is that working? Is that working? Is that working? Okay, we have to hold it really, really close. Okay. I'll just hold it then. Okay. So Daniel, what do you think is the strongest argument against your position that you've ever come across? Or the one that's challenged you most?
The strongest argument against atheism. Are you just talking about design?
No, just in general.
Okay. Well, in my opinion, actually, the strongest argument against atheism, goodness. You know, I asked Matt Dillahunty this question once, and he said, I haven't heard one yet. Well, for a long time, I was really compelled by the sudden explosion of Christianity around the 1st and 2nd century. I felt like that was a really strong argument for a while, but after digging into it a lot further, I found a lot of information that made it not so strong. So for a while that was, but that's the best answer I've got.
So at the moment, would you say that there's anything that particularly challenges you or not really?
No.
So nothing in my presentation tonight swayed you at all?
Well, like I said in my rebuttal, a big part of the fine-tuning argument is looking at the odds of all of these things happening and making a big hand-waving argument about that. But if you're looking at it from the future, then, like I said, it's what are the odds that we would all be here tonight? Well, those are astronomical if you did the math, but since we're looking at it in the past, we can either say that everything is a miracle or nothing is. And I think it's much more reasonable to say that nothing is a miracle, and we leave miracles to be violations of the laws of nature, which we have never witnessed.
Okay. So if we go to one of the examples I used a lot, so if we talk about fingerprints on a gun, and we say, I think to get away from blaming me for it, or we'll say it was Trump or something. If we found Donald Trump's fingerprints on a gun, if you suggested to me that this was, good evidence that he'd used it or at least been in close contact with it, and I said, for example, how do you know that the world could have been any different? How do you know that it was possible that the fingerprints wouldn't be on the gun? How would you respond to that?
Well, first I would respond by saying that you're committing the very mistake I advise us all against committing. You are comparing the universe, which is a one-of-a-kind thingamajig, to fingerprints on a gun, which is something we can all relate to. The fingerprints on a gun is a form of evidence that is directly linked to identification of an individual, in this case Donald Trump, which wouldn't surprise me at all. But when it comes to the universe, the evidence that you're talking about, the alleged God fingerprints, they are not actually stored in a DNA database somewhere that say, yes, those belong to God. The evidence that you cited would all still exist even if there wasn't a God. So as long as you're citing evidence that would be there regardless of your conclusion, I don't see how it's any evidence in favor of your conclusion.
Okay. So to take another example, one that kind of deals with the universe as a whole, I think, let's say, for example, scientists look really close down an electron microscope or an even more powerful microscope, and they found that on every single atom in the universe, they had found inscribed the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one," and so on. Suppose scientists found that inscribed on every atom. Would you think that was good evidence for God's existence?
Absolutely. I would be a believer.
Okay. And what if someone said to you, how do you know that anything else was possible? How do you know that it's possible the atoms could have been any other way? Would you say that it's clearly possible, or how would you respond?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you rephrase?
So, suppose we found that, and someone says, well, we're dealing with the universe. We only have one universe. We don't know that the universe could have been any different. For all we know, it had to be the way that, whether there's a God or not, that all the atoms in the universe, just by some law of necessity, had these words written on them.
Oh,
How would you respond?
Well, the big difference there is that a message written in the atomic structure of an atom that was specifically readable by us would be indicative that it was put there on purpose. But the way atomic structure is, it would be that way regardless of us being here. And in fact, there's no message written in atoms today. So I guess in this hypothetical construct, well, I certainly wouldn't assume that it could be any other way, but I think that would be very strong evidence that we were meant to read a message.
So what would make it evidence? How would you go about showing that it's evidence? So I tried to give an account of evidence where I said that, as far as we can tell, the best way philosophers of science have so far of analyzing whether something is evidence or not is to talk about probabilities and to say, if this theory was true, we'd expect to find this, we'd expect to find this evidence, but if it's false, then the chances are we wouldn't find it. As far as I can tell, that's the best way and the only way we really have of telling whether something is evidence for a theory or not. And in that case, I'm not really sure how your response works. How is it saying this is evidence? If you're saying, yeah, if we found these words written on every atom in the universe, that would be evidence. Why is that? What would make it evidence?
Okay, I understand. I'm saying yes, that would be evidence, because we live in a universe where that's not the case. So we have a basis for comparison. Now, if we lived in a universe where that was the case and we didn't know anything different, then yes, I agree. Because we only have a sample size of one, we wouldn't have anything to compare it to, and so we wouldn't know for certain. I'm only saying that it would be evidence because I grew up in a universe where rationality is atomic structures without a message. So it's something I can't really get away from.
Okay. So suppose we move the example to a real life one, which is, in fact, the case. If we talk about the Big Bang, for example, the Big Bang is a kind of... Hello? No? Going again. The Big Bang is a unique event. The universe is a unique universe. we don't know for sure that it could have been any other way. Perhaps the universe just has to be the way it is. Nevertheless, most scientists think, for example, that various features of the light spectrum, for example, are good evidence for the Big Bang. And I'm inclined to agree with them. But it seems to be available to someone to just say, well, the universe, maybe it couldn't have been any other way. Maybe the universe had to have these, changes in the light spectrum and so on. Maybe this evidence is a necessary feature of the universe. It couldn't have been any other way. And so I don't buy that it's evidence for the Big Bang. Maybe it's just there by necessity. How would you respond to that?
Well, science is all about taking observations and making connections from one observation to the next very soundly and very safely and very meticulously. And they have done that in order to arrive at the eventual conclusion that there was a Big Bang about 14 billion years ago. They didn't just come up with this, oh, the universe just exploded, and then started looking for evidence after the fact in order to make that fit. The Big Bang hypothesis was only the end result of several small steps that we made over time. So it sounds to me like you're equating the conclusion of the Big Bang to a conclusion of God. But in the case of God, the God hypothesis existed before we had any scientific evidence whatsoever. And people who believed in God started going out and looking for things that they could say, oh, hey, that's evidence for God. Well, it's also evidence for the Big Bang, but hey, it's evidence for God. But when we came up with the Big Bang, we got there step by step, and it was the last thing that we decided, not the first thing.
Okay. So do you think it's a crucial feature of scientific theories that they only come up with a theory after the evidence is in?
Well, no, certainly not. I think a lot of scientific inquiry and investigation occurs because people think that something maybe occurred a certain way. But they only think that based on current evidence and observation. Somebody didn't just come up with the Big Bang idea with no supporting evidence whatsoever. They made a measurement and they thought, oh, well, that must mean our universe is expanding, and then they went from there.
So how is it that you think the evidence works? Do you think it works by comparing other possibilities, other ways that the universe could have been, or do you think it works in some other way?
No, at least in science, it doesn't work by considering all possibilities. I'm a chess player, so I'm going to use a chess analogy. In chess, there are only so many legal moves you can make at any given time. So you can't move every possible piece, and just like in science, you can't consider every possible scenario. You're limited to a finite set. In the case of chess, it's roughly like 13 or 14 moves at any given time. And same goes for science. Every piece of evidence limits the possibilities more and more until we get down to a point where a scientist can say, well, I think our universe exploded about 14 billion years ago. It's either that or maybe 3 or 4 other possibilities, so let's dig deeper into each of them.
Okay. I think we're out of time for the cross-examination, so thank you.
We're going to, yes. We have one microphone for Q&A, but we will do it like this. If you have a question for Daniel Jackson, please line up behind Dr. Zach. Question for Dr. Miller, line up over there, and we'll alternate on the one single microphone. I simply ask that your question is 2 minutes or less. Repeat after me, 2 minutes or less. And that it is cogent to the conversation, which tonight is pretty broad. So we will start on the floor. We'll start on the floor with Dr. Zach.
Dr. Miller, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence again. It's great to see you here again in Texas. Although I will point out that I think the last time you were here, you forgot to bring home your handgun, your complimentary handgun. So I have it in my car for you afterwards.
And his horse, too.
Right. Yeah. But it's interesting, you pointed out the question of if we found a gun that had fingerprints on it, then that's a way to sort of test to see whether someone had handled it. And it occurred to me that that testing was actually kind of relevant to this discussion, right? And so you're a medical doctor right now, and you're in your practice or in your training at any rate, you certainly come in contact with lots of different tests for things, right? And so we can maybe talk about the design question as a test for design, perhaps. And I was just wondering, in order for a test to be useful, for it to have value, for it to be practical in medical context or otherwise, we have to have some sense of what the false positive rate and what the false negative rate is. That is to say, I guess maybe when it comes to design, do we have clear positive examples of what a theologically designed universe would look like, and clear negative examples of what an undesigned universe would look like, so that we can compare, so that when we look at our universe, we have some clear way of assessing whether or not the design question is valid for that?
Yeah. I think there are kind of two aspects to it. So whenever you talk about a test, it's always going to be unique in some way. So if I perform a blood test on a patient, you can always say, well, that's unique because you've never performed this particular blood test for celiac disease on this particular patient. You don't know what the positive, you don't know what the false positive rates are for this particular blood test on this particular patient because it's the first time you've done it. So all of those tests are going to be unique in some way. But there are obviously ways of generalizing, and that's to say, what is the false positive rate of this test more generally in the wider population? And I think we can sort of do that with some of these things when we're talking about how God might act. So although we can't necessarily say, what are the false positive rates for the universe being this way, we can say, how likely is it, given our evidence, that people who are morally good people invest in relationships with other people, create relationships with other people, and do things to facilitate those relationships. And the evidence we have seems to suggest that morally good people do those things all the time, and so they're prone to do that. And I think that's a good reason to suspect that God, if the hypothesis is that he's a morally perfect person, would do similar sorts of things. And so that's kind of a way of approaching it, I think, that would be fairly reasonable.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Jackson, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah. This is going to upset some people out there who base their lives on faith, but faith is just a fancy way of saying, I wish it were true. If you want to try to argue against that, you're welcome to. When it comes to the universe, we only have one. I mean, that's just the truth of it. We only have one. Our sample size is one. We don't have the size of a set necessary to determine false positives. We don't have any kind of control group. We have no way to narrow down our conclusions. We only have one universe. So we just have to accept the truth that we have and do the best we can with it. And when it comes to design, since we only have one universe and no basis for comparison, all of this talk about, well, if the constants were different, or the universe would be chaos if there was no God, all these kinds of things, these are all wishful thinking in order to make the argument stronger. But with only one universe, it's all just, that's testing? Yeah. With only one universe, all of that is just hand-waving stuff. So,
thank you.
Okay. My question is that Dr. Miller, you pointed out that because we see repeatability and all of the odds being so slim, but everything being reproducible as evidence of intelligent design, correct?
So there's two parts to the argument. One is that these things would be really unlikely if God didn't exist, but they're fairly predictable if God did exist.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can say that it's because God exists that we see this reproducibility that we can base science on, I believe was what you were saying.
Yeah.
So why is it that when people see miracles happen, things that are unlikely, they can say that's also evidence of God? How do you rectify that?
So, yeah, I think it's a good question. I think one of the things I'd say there is that not all miracle claims are good evidence of God's existence. I mean, if anything, I think most of them aren't very good evidence that God exists. So a lot of the time, it's complete charlatans just pretending that they're performing miracles for fame or money or whatever. Sometimes it's kind of honest mistakes and honest bad inferences, and it's something that could be attributed to God but isn't a very good argument for God. It's not very good evidence. Sometimes I think miracles can be good evidence for God's existence, though. And I think the reason for that is that although we would expect God to generally create a universe which was generally regular, that's in order that we can generally and usually perform actions which affect other people meaningfully. That doesn't preclude him from very, very occasionally performing miracles. Because, for example, him raising Jesus from the dead isn't something that's going to throw the whole universe into chaos in the sense that it will stop people knowing what their actions are going to do. Him raising Jesus from the dead is still going to let people act meaningfully and generally predict the effects of their actions. And so I think God might still be expected in some cases to perform miracles if he has really good reasons for doing so. I don't have time to go into the reasons for doing so in terms of particular miracles, but I think if you want to say that a miracle is evidence for God, you have to give some indication of why you think God would do that if he existed.
But on the same note, if you're saying that he could perform miracles because he has a really good reason, why would he not perform a very clear indication that he exists for everyone to see if it were that simple?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things I was saying earlier is one of the things that challenges me in the sense that this could actually be some small evidence against God. I think there is a decent argument you could make which has the same kind of structure. Like, if God didn't exist, it's not surprising that some people don't believe in him. But if God did exist, it's sort of surprising that some people don't believe in him. I don't think it's hugely compelling, though, because I think there are some reasonable reasons why God might want to keep himself distant for a little bit. One of those, I think, is that if his existence becomes too obvious, for example, it can undermine the idea of free will, and it can undermine people doing things because they're genuinely the right thing to do. So if, for example, I know for certain that God exists, I'm always going to do the right thing, not because I really care about doing the right thing or because I'm, noble for risking my own security to do the right thing. It's just because I know that in the end, God's going to give me something better or punish me with something worse or something like that. And that's what can result with certainty sometimes. And I think with me personally, that would result. And so I think it's a good thing for at least some people that they have something to lose by doing the right thing, so that it's genuinely a risk that they take and genuinely a sacrifice they make in uncertainty to do the right thing. And God giving that uncertainty, I think, allows that kind of free will in a more robust way.
Okay. Daniel, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I have 3 quick things to say. I find it interesting that the believing side of these arguments always exists in this state where the evidence that they are citing could also be evidence against their position. The evidence is pretty much up for interpretation. In the case of performing miracles, people say all the time, well, God cured my cancer. Well, but cancer also just goes into remission. So I think a piece of evidence for a miracle would be God healing an amputee. That has never happened. But that would be an example of a miracle.
Starfish would beg to disagree.
Ah, starfish, yes. The other thing I wanted to say is about, he said that if God revealed himself, then we would no longer act out of free will because we would know he existed, and so we would just do good things because God required it. So 2 quick responses to that. If Dr. Miller's faith is strong enough that he's up here arguing for God's existence, shouldn't he be behaving like a saint right now? And yet, he's still drinking alcohol as far as I can tell. I mean, that's a good point. If he believes it as strongly as he thinks he does, then he should be acting as though God does exist. So that's one thing there. And 2, when it comes to the free will thing, Seth Andrews, in a debate I saw, he made this very good point that apparently in heaven, free will still exists. That's the claim as heaven is described. But heaven is supposed to be free of sin. So if people in heaven know that God exists because they're in heaven, but they still have free will, then it seems like an existence that allows for sin could actually be here on earth as well. I mean, it exists in heaven. So I don't see how knowing that God exists would somehow prevent evil actions from still occurring, because heaven is apparently like that. So.
online for Daniel Jackson. Joel, if probability is no good use to us after the fact, how do we scientifically assess anything in the past?
If probability is no good use to us after the fact, how do we assess the past? Is that right? Well, okay, I think I understand the question. So there's a difference between looking at how probable an event was to have occurred by taking in all the information that occurred versus how probable was that event as though we were in a state before it. That's really the big difference here. So I like to use that roulette wheel as an example. To look at 8 double zeros in a row, which again I have a picture of, to look at that and say, wow, the odds were just astronomical, it must have been a miracle, but then again it happened. So we can assess the probability of that occurring, but it comes to a matter of predicting that it can occur. Because if somebody had said, okay, starting now, the roulette wheel is going to show 8 double zeros in a row. Well, if that actually occurred, the odds of that would be so astronomical that that would be a miracle. And so assessing it from the future state would be like put ourselves into the past and then come up with that prediction. But just analyzing the odds of it occurring after the fact, it doesn't have any explanatory power because it did occur. So there's no reason to use that to draw any sort of a conclusion.
So props to both of you for being able to stand up there and do this, because there's no way I could do what you guys are doing. My question's for Dr. Miller. You're putting forth a hypothesis, essentially, about how the universe works by asserting that there's a God. And inherent sort of in that hypothesis, you guys aren't stating it explicitly, but there's an assumption of complexity. God has to be more complex than the thing he's designing. I mean, we're more complex than cars and watches and the things that we design. So you sort of have to assume that God is more complex than this universe. So if that's the case, then your proposal doesn't really solve the problem, because then you have the question of where does God come from? Is there another God that was more complex than that God that created him? Ad infinitum. It's the old turtles all the way down argument. So I just don't understand how you find that compelling when the simpler explanation is just that maybe there was 10 to the 23rd attempts for the universe to work out, and the numbers didn't match up, and the universe exploded or imploded or whatever, and this time it got it right, and we're all here to ask, what are the odds that the universe could be here like it is for us to ask the question? I mean, it seems a lot like shooting an arrow, and you hit a tree and you went and draw a bullseye around it. So it's I guess it's kind of two questions in one, but it just seems like you're sort of you're presupposed, or it's post facto rationalization, and how do you sort of get around the problem of this infinite regress of complexity rather that's required if you assume a God that's more complex than the universe that you're in?
Yeah, so I think there's a sense in which God's complex, but I didn't make the claim that God's complex. I don't necessarily think that, for example, the universe has to have come from something complex. I didn't make that assumption or use that as a premise in any of my arguments. Obviously, there is a sense in which God is complex, just in the sense that he's extremely intelligent and able to do complex things and so on. But I don't think, as a theory, the theory that God exists is a complex theory. So typically when philosophers of science talk about complexity of a theory itself or simplicity of a theory, they normally prefer simpler theories. And some of the work that's been done on this is pretty difficult to assess because not much work has been done on it. But the general consensus seems to be roughly that simple theories involve ones which don't posit many entities. They posit as few things as possible, and things like that. And so in that case, there's obviously a lot more to it, but in that case, it at least suggests that the multiverse, for example, where you have a billion universes, and one of which just happened to get the laws of physics right, I think that's an extremely complex hypothesis because it posits so many entities just to explain this one thing. Whereas by the same token, theism isn't a complex hypothesis, it just posits one thing. Like I said, there's much more to it, and you have to work out the theory of complexity and what makes a theory simple in much more detail. I've tried to do that in a paper I've written, which I can show you afterwards. So there is more to it. I'm not going to pretend that that means on its own that God is a simple theory, but I wouldn't say that theism is a complex theory. I'd say it's a simple theory that explains the world quite parsimoniously.
Well, I don't think you the need to assume that God is more complex than the universe? I mean, since we're talking about Game of Thrones, I mean, God could be Hodor, you know. You still have to explain where it came from, and it doesn't answer the question. It just poses another question. Okay, so Hodor created the universe. Where did Hodor come from? It's still an infinite regress problem. Even if Hodor Senior created Hodor Junior. Sorry, I have too many blood and honeys. Then you still have the same question to answer. I mean, it's making the problem more complex than just I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I think the problem is if you think that God is actually more difficult to explain than the way the universe is, then I think that is a reasonable problem to have. And I think you should just say the universe is a brute fact. The universe is just the way it is, and we can't necessarily explain that if we don't have a better explanation. I think God is in some ways difficult to explain, and there's a mystery about why he exists. And sometimes in science, we just have to go back to a brute fact and say, we can't give any deeper explanation of this. And that's not wholly satisfying. And I think in some ways, that's the case with God. We might just have to say, he is the brute fact. But I think in every case in science, you have to have a brute fact, whether it's satisfying or not. The question is just whether that brute fact is more satisfying than the brute fact of the stuff it's trying to explain. So if I have the universe with all its incredibly difficult things to explain and the extreme improbabilities of everything in the universe that could really easily be explained by God, and then if on the other hand I have God who has some mystery about him and it is in some ways difficult to explain, but who doesn't have the same kind of complexity in terms of the theory as the universe existing as a brute fact, I think it's reasonable to go with theism as the theory that explains it.
It sounds like you're just relabeling axioms God. But Dan, did you have anything you wanted to throw in? Sorry.
Yeah, and I actually want to stand up for this one. It's just a minute. This is something that really, really bothers me about every conversation about religion that happens. And it's a problem that is permeating through our political scene, especially today. We humans, we really like to turn subjective things into objective things. And here's a perfect example. The universe is complex, or the universe is simple. Both of these are subjective opinions. Without any basis for comparison, to call the universe complex is completely made up. You cannot base an argument on calling the universe complex or calling the universe simple, or God is complex or simple. So to come along and say, oh, well, the universe was extremely improbable, you have no way of actually knowing that to be the case. Or you could say, oh, well, there's a billion universes out there. Well, you have no way of knowing that either, because we only know about one. So whether it's determining which gender somebody is, that's a subjective opinion, and it's up to the person whose gender you're talking about, or the universe being complex or simple, without a basis for comparison, all you're ever going to get is a subjective opinion, and that is no basis for a conclusion. Thank you.
Question submitted by Nolan for Daniel Jackson online.
Oh.
You admitted that the constants and quantities of the universe do not hold their values necessarily, so you concede that they are possibly different, meaning that there's a set of possible worlds in which each world of that set holds one of the possible values. This set is an infinitely large set, yet you balk at Calum for forcing us to consider a large set when this is the very set you concede. The question, what other than your naturalistic bias forces you to consider a smaller set of possible worlds to explain the fine-tuning of the universe?
Well, I think this was a misunderstanding of what I said. I said, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you with absolute certainty that our constants cannot be different. That would be dishonest. And your skeptic voices should yell at me if I said something like that. What I did say, though, was that in the history of science and in the history of measuring these constants, we have never detected any evidence or any reason whatsoever to believe that they could be any different than what they are. So to start to draw conclusions based on the hypothetical idea that they could be different, even though we have no evidence for that, is fallacious. I think that's all I said, yeah. That was just a misunderstanding of what I said. The only thing I'm conceding is that we cannot know with absolute certainty that they cannot be different, but we have no reason to suspect that they could be.
During your opening remarks, I was a little surprised when you mentioned that you twice referenced a God that seeks a personal relationship with us, and that we should also be seeking personal relationships with each other. Significant personal relationships, I believe, was the phrase that you used. We all have significant personal relationships. I seek to have a significant personal relationship with my girlfriend. When I do this, it takes constant two-way communication between us. So I'm
Two-way.
I'm seeking out a way to understand a God that does not allow us that two-way communication. If how could I reasonably expect my girlfriend to want to have a relationship with me at all if a debate like this has to exist to prove that I even exist?
We've got another topic for the next BBC.
Yeah, no kidding. And you asked us of the single guy, right? Oh, yeah.
No, I think in a way it's a very considerable frustration, and it's one that I have. So I'm very bad at prayer. I try to pray. I pray reasonably often, but it's a frustration I have. Sometimes it's just like, why can't you just tell me more clearly what you want? And I think that's a completely natural frustration to have. I think part of it is what I was saying earlier about God. If he was too obvious, and if his existence was so clear to us, it could really undermine the kind of significance of our sacrifices. So just to kind of re-emphasize that point, if it was completely obvious to me that God existed, I know me personally, I would base everything just on the fact that I might be going to hell or whatever if I did something wrong, or I might be rewarded if I do something right. It wouldn't be because I had anything to lose from making that sacrifice for doing something for something else. Now, obviously, when it comes to normal personal relationships, the same dynamic isn't in play because most people don't have that same kind of power over us, and they don't have the way we act towards them doesn't have the same eternal consequences. But in the case of God, we do have something where the eternal consequences could well be extremely important and could well just override any other consideration we might have for acting. That's how humans work. They're compelled by these consequences whether they like it or not. And so my suggestion is that if we really are to make these kind of real sacrifices, if I'm going to do something to make a real sacrifice for someone else, I see someone homeless and I give them everything I have to help make their life better, for example. I knew that I was going to be rewarded eventually for that, I would find it very difficult to have the sacrificial element of that at the forefront. If I knew that there was a chance it might be completely unrewarded, if I knew that whatever I did, there's a reasonable chance God exists and I might be rewarded for it, but on the other hand, I might just be completely losing everything I have, I think that makes a way for a much more fruitful means of self-sacrifice and genuine compassion and goodwill towards our neighbors.
I'm a little shocked when you bring up the concept of hell,
Mm-hmm.
because when you say that, you're saying we should establish a personal relationship with God for fear that if that relationship does not exist, we go to hell. I'm sorry, but that's the same kind of argument that abusive husbands make towards their wives, that, you know, if you don't love me, I will beat you. It doesn't make I don't. Who wants that kind of relationship with anybody?
So I'm not saying that I'm not saying that that's the reason we should act or anything like that. I'm personally agnostic on hell and exactly what it is. I believe that there is hell, but I think arguments, for example, for annihilationism are quite good, where the strongest biblical evidence I can see is that people who aren't ultimately saved no longer cease to exist. I don't believe in eternal torture or anything like that. But my point in any case wasn't that we should act so as to avoid hell. My point is that humans happen to be such, I know at least I happen to be such, that if I knew that there were really important consequences in the eventualities of the world that really significantly affected my own pleasure, I would find it very difficult to act for anything except that. I would find it very difficult to act out of genuine goodwill for other people. I would find it very difficult to make any kind of sacrifice when I knew that doing the right thing was going to get me these rewards, for example. That's what I was getting at, not saying what you what I thought I was saying. So I hope that clears
Thank
it
you
up.
for clarifying. Daniel?
Well, you kind of took my comment. I was going to say, if you don't love me, I will punish you. If you do something I don't like, you must beg for my forgiveness. If you leave me, I will make you suffer. I mean, these are all statements in domestic abuse relationships, and they're also very much Christian. But to respond to what Dr. Miller said about annihilation, if you consider what the Bible says about heaven, which is not very much, it's actually very little, the one thing it makes very clear is that heaven is all about worshiping God forever. So if I had to choose between that and just not existing at all, I'd probably not exist. Anyway, go ahead.
It seems to me that the whole question of design in the universe comes down to what is the quality or what is the nature of that volume in configuration space and that will produce observers in the universe. And although we can't, it's not the same as probability. For instance, if you say that, well, gravitation can only be a particular value or people can't exist, or observers can't exist even if they're silicon-based or anything else. But that's where I was going with that. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. Okay, so if you say that the gravitation is, has to be fine-tuned to one part in 10 to the 60th, that's not the same as saying that there's one chance in 10 to the 60th that the universe is habitable, right? Because we don't know that, if you roll a die and you pull up a 6, is it a 1 in 6 chance you got that, or is it 6s all the way around, or whatever? But we can look at the nature of the configuration space and say that, as many physicists have pointed out, that that volume in configuration space that will produce observers anywhere in the universe is extremely tiny. For one, wouldn't you say that that's kind of peculiar, or doesn't that tell us something when we see that this area in configuration space is so tiny, and yet that's where we find the characteristics of our universe? And secondly, what does it mean later on, tomorrow, next week, when another discovery is made in sciences that prove that this area, this volume in configuration space is actually smaller than we thought it was before?
Was that for me or?
For you.
Thank
Oh,
you.
sorry. Okay, thank you. It's interesting that you talk about configuration space. This is something I didn't get to say in my presentation. The whole fine-tuning argument rests on that the values for the constants had to be exactly as they are to allow for life. And life is so unbelievably improbable that the constants had to be a certain value in order to allow for it. Okay? So how powerful is this God anyway? I mean, isn't he the one that decided everything? So when you talk about this space and all of the possible values and only the one winds up being for life, well, didn't God set that up as well, if you're claiming that God exists? And if that's the case, then why did he make it so improbable and yet create life to occur? I mean, you see what I'm kind of getting at? It seems like if God can decide everything, then he could have made life very easy. And he could have made the constant, he could have just not had any constants. He could have just had, here's one solar system, there's life on there, and that's how the universe works, and it would all make sense, it would all be rational. He could have done that. So when you argue about all of the possibilities that exist, and science comes out with a new discovery explaining why this is that and so forth, we are dealing with the reality that we have been given. And if there was a God that was pulling all of the strings, it seems like the universe being the way it is proves that God had no say in anything, because he set it up to be this very improbable way, and he set up the space to be exactly as it is, and it just doesn't make all that much sense.
Well, it sounds like if I go to a golf course and I say that, wow, there's there's all these fairways and greens, but one little hole. How odd for the golf course designer to do that. Well, if I didn't understand the game of golf, I might say that, but if I understood the game of golf, I would say, well, of course. You don't want to make that hole any bigger than it is. You don't want to scatter them all over the place. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like you're really not telling us much about the quality, the qualities of God that are restricted according to that. So if we know that the area configuration space is very small, does that tell us that God is, if there is a God, that he's inept? Or does it tell us that, I mean, he has a lot of options, and why did he choose this one? In order to know why God does anything, you'd have to know what all of his purposes are.
Well, when you say that he had a lot of options, God, based on what we understand, all-powerful being, it doesn't really make sense to say that he had a lot of options. God just did whatever he wanted to do. And if he wanted to create life, then he should have created life. To understand why he did what he did, well, I mean, to go back to your golf course idea, if you look at the construction of a golf course before it begins, and you understand the intention of the golf course, then creating that little hole makes perfect sense, of course. But like you said, if you're looking at a golf course and you have no idea the purpose of golf, then putting that hole in there doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So it's only this after-the-fact kind of realization, which is something that we invent for ourselves. I mean, a lot of people say that mankind invented God, and part of that is inventing a reason why we are here, inventing a reason for that hole. So to start in the after the fact and then go back to the beginning and say, oh, well, it must have been done intentionally, even though it doesn't make any sense, well, it just doesn't make any sense. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'm not sure what you're saying doesn't make any sense, but I'll hand it off.
Yeah.
The only thing I was going to say to add to that is, in these kind of situations, you initially talked about the configurations and the volume of configuration space. So normally what kind of scientists and statisticians do in these cases is they apply what's called the principle of indifference. And they say, where we don't have experimental evidence telling us about the frequency of something, we say that there's an equal probability of everything, of every different possibility. And that's a fairly well kind of established rule. There are some kind of caveats and nuances needed for it. But that's how people come up with these sorts of probabilities. And historians of science will note examples where this has been used and where this has been necessary for the derivation of theorems for scientific progress. And so when we don't have these kind of frequencies about how often things occur under some theories and how often they occur under other theories and so on, we don't actually need that kind of experimental data in order to come up with these kind of probabilities about how likely is it we'd find this evidence if God existed, how likely is it we'd find this evidence if God didn't exist. What we do is we look at the possibilities and we assign each of them an equal probability, and that's how we come up with these kind of probabilities. And so my suggestion was that if we look at all the possibilities for the force of gravity, we can go from 0 or negative, if you're measuring it like that, up to something either within our range of what our models can tell us or even further than that. And if we apply the same probability to each of those, then that's how we come up with the probabilities that I was talking about when I said, for example, that the probability of gravity being the right strength, if God doesn't exist, is fairly minimal. So that's kind of a wider elaboration of how you get those probabilities.
And see, my skeptic voice says, we don't know, so we're just going to make stuff up. And I believe in God, so the stuff that I make up is going to conclude that God exists. That's how that sounds.
Question, Dr. Miller?
Questions for Daniel. The first one being, do you believe that matter or any type of substance has always existed? The second question, how do you, if you believe that we're simply maybe accidents or byproducts of an accident occurring, how do you make a distinction between actions of, say, hospitality and rape, one being wrong or right?
Okay. The matter question is something that the honest answer is we don't know. We do have this theory, I think, it's called a theory, that matter is neither ever created or destroyed. Of course, that's based in the universe that we know of, so take that for what it is. My personal favorite theory about how our universe got started and why it is doing what it does is the only other thing in nature that we know of that actually accelerates as it does what it does are black holes. And our universe is expanding. That's the other thing. So it makes sense to me that maybe our universe is just on the other side of a black hole that formed in some other universe somewhere. Maybe. I'm speculating. But it would make sense that since our universe is expanding, then maybe all of that matter that is expanding is coming from a black hole from somewhere else. Again, total speculation. But to answer your other question, you touched on morality and the difference between right and wrong. I would love, Ezra, to do a debate one day on objective versus subjective morality. This was actually a conversation that my wife and I had on our first date.
Romantic.
I wholeheartedly believe in completely subjective morality. There is nothing wrong with saying that we get to decide what is right and wrong for us. And yeah, you can come along and say, oh, well, you know, the Nazis and gas chambers and stuff, how can you argue that that may have been right? You can't say it's just an opinion. Well, yes, I can. It is just an opinion that we all disagree with, and that's why we fought so hardly against them. So we can collectively decide that rape is absolutely wrong and hospitality is absolutely right. And because of the way evolution works, which is part of allowing our species to survive, we have learned how to evolve a sense of morality that encourages the survival of our species as a whole, which includes doing things right for each other, that's why we call right, and not doing things wrong against each other, because that does hurt the survivability of our species as a whole. Hope that answers your question.
I guess back with the black hole, was that always, did at least a black hole always exist then?
Oh, well, yeah, so in that theory then, the idea would be that in this multiverse concept, there has been something that has always existed. A universe forms a black hole, and that creates our universe. And then our universe creates black holes, and those form other universes, which is actually not that difficult to at least consider as a possibility, because that same process is exactly what biological evolution does. Our universe has mutations, black holes, and those create new universes with their own properties. Maybe the constants are different, we don't know. But it keeps going ad infinitum, whatever you call that.
Ben? We're going to finish after her. And then, go ahead.
Thank you both for a really interesting discussion tonight. It's given me quite a bit to think about. One of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been listening to both of you is the principle of sufficient reason. And it seems to me that on certain arguments for what's been presented tonight, it certainly seems to present arguments for and against certain conceptions of God. But I'm not sure that the conception of God that I have in mind has been undermined at all. It seems to me that you are committed to something like the principle of sufficient reason, which I would just want to state like this. For any truth that is contingent, it's contingent upon something, and that cries out for explanation. And we need to ask, well, why is this instead of something else? Now, on my view, a lot of the things that are contingent ultimately upon God. So when we ask, why is the world this way and not some other way, we could say, well, because God created it. Now, given the principle of sufficient reason, which I think is very latent in your thought, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to ask what would the world look like if God didn't exist. Because given the principle of sufficient reason, there are a number of different articulations of various cosmological arguments that would lead us to think that there wouldn't be any world at all if there weren't a God. And God, on this analysis, turns out to be a necessary being who is perfect in the metaphysical sense. So if the principle of sufficient reason seems to be driving so much of your thought, and that tends to undergird cosmological arguments, how much of your thinking just kind of disappears if my answer to your question, what would the world look like if there were no God, turns out to be there wouldn't be a world at all? I'll take my answer seated. Thank you.
Well, this question is guilty of doing what I accuse all of the design arguments of doing. You are manipulating what we don't know. You are changing up what we don't know and then trying to create an argument out of it. To ask the question, what would our universe look like if there wasn't a God, presupposes that our universe looks the way it does because there is a God. But since we only have one universe, we can't make that assumption. And the only reason why I asked that question is because in order to definitively say that our universe is in fact designed, you have to have an idea in mind of what the universe would look like if it wasn't designed. Because design is a subjective concept. It's something that we assess when we look at something. So without any basis for comparison, or sufficient reason, as you say, any kind of conclusion that we could draw, it's completely something that we can just make up in our heads. But it's not compelling. It's not an empirical answer. And there's no evidence that we can draw on just by looking at our single universe with no other basis for comparison and then concluding, well, it must be the way it is because there's some supernatural deity. Because it could look exactly the way it does without that God. And I see you chuckling, so maybe I didn't answer your question. Maybe Calum could do a better job. You want to?
Last question? Okay. It all centers on you. This is it. All eyes. You are the summary.
All right, so this is for Dr. Miller.
Speak into the mic. I'm sorry.
I'm short. I'm sorry.
Tilt it down.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So this is for Dr. Miller. So you grew up in England, which is predominantly surrounded by the Church of England, right?
Yeah.
I'm from Texas, which is in the Bible Belt, with predominantly Baptists, for instance. So oftentimes you grow up believing the religion of your parents and those around you. So knowing that geographical influence, how comfortable would you be with a universe that is designed if it were done by, say, the Muslim God or the Hindu pantheon or the Greeks or the Aztecs or the Egyptians? Why does it have to be the Christian God?
Yeah, so in order to answer the first question, just in terms of my personal situation, so my dad isn't really very religious. And my mum isn't really religious in the same kind of way that I am, and we have very different beliefs about most stuff. So I'm kind of confident that my beliefs in particular aren't very influenced by my family or my upbringing or anything. In terms of how I'd feel about other people making the same kind of arguments, I think if they were good arguments that the universe had a designer, then I'd accept them. I'm happy to accept any good arguments. The difficulty, of course, with those, from my perspective, is when they conclude that, for example, Allah exists and sent the Prophet Muhammad and dictated the Quran to him. And the reason I take issue with those is because I don't think there's any good evidence for those claims in particular. I think Muslims and people of other religions, Sikhs, get it right when they say the universe was created by God, but I think they get it wrong when they make more specific claims about God's prophets and so on. And the main reason I think they're mistaken about those is because I've never seen very good evidence for the teachings of their religion. And in some cases, I've seen good evidence against the teachings of their religion. So, for example, just a very brief one, is that the Quran teaches that Jesus wasn't crucified on a cross, or wasn't killed by crucifixion, and I think there's very good historical evidence that he was. And so I think that militates quite heavily against Islam and the divine dictation or angelic dictation of the Quran to Muhammad. By contrast, I think there's very good evidence for the truth of Christianity in particular. So although the arguments that I gave tonight, I would never suggest show that the Christian God exists. I would never say this is, good evidence that Christianity in particular is true. I think they get you some of the way there. And then once you get to that point, you can look at the evidence about what God might have said to people in the world or how he might have revealed himself. And in the case of Jesus, I think there is good evidence that he revealed himself through Jesus. And that's for a number of reasons, which I don't have time to articulate in full here. But that's the way I do it. The design argument gets you to God's existence, and I think that's an important step. But then deciding which other religion is the right one, I think, has to go to more detailed historical evidence.
I do, yeah. I'm glad you brought up other religions. This was actually one of the annoying questions I asked as a kid. And Dr. Miller's response actually kind of confuses me, because he says, The Quran states that Jesus wasn't crucified, but we have good evidence that that occurred. So he seems to imply that, therefore, we should dismiss the entire Quran. Well, we all know that there are many mistakes in the Bible, absolute contradictions that have been refuted with evidence. So does that mean we should dismiss everything the Bible says as well? The Quran says that Muhammad ascended to the sky on a horse, I think it was. We're not supposed to believe that, but we are supposed to believe that Jesus walked on water and made bread for 5,000 people. But both of those books have mistakes in them. So I feel like it's selective cherry picking if you want to pick one and not the other. So I actually agree with your question. The Joel Osteen response that I got as a kid was that all of the different religions talk about their different gods, but it's actually all the same God, and he's fine as long as people are nice to each other.
We're going to transition to closing statements. 5 minutes, starting with Daniel Jackson.
Oh, great.
I guess I'll leave.
Closing statement. Well, I just found out that we got closing statements a couple days ago, and I couldn't think of a better closing statement than one that was written by somebody else. So I'm going to read that for you, because tonight the topic is design, and I don't think anybody said it better than Carl Sagan. So up here in this picture, that circle is surrounding planet Earth, and it's an image taken by the Voyager as it was on its way into outer space. And this is what Carl Sagan had to say about this. Please listen to these words. This is very important. From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of any particular interest, but for us, it's different. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, and Marco Rubio, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequently their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, and how fervent their hatreds, and how much they insist that some people cannot use certain bathrooms. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in this universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark, and in our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from anywhere else to save us from ourselves and from Donald Trump. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit, yes, but settle, no. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish that pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. So take care of our home. Thank you.
Daniel Jackson. Closing statement.
Yeah. So thank you again for all staying out. Thank you to Daniel for a wonderful debate and a real good discussion. I've enjoyed the discussions I've had with you down on the floor as well. I hope I can come back again sometime. I'd really love to. Whatever it would be nice to talk about. I'm sure Ez will have something in mind. in many ways, Daniel is absolutely right. And I think what he talks about here, the pale blue dot, is something that the biblical writers actually reflect on fairly forthrightly and fairly honestly. So the writer of the Psalms says, "What is man that God would be mindful of him?" The Bible is always realistic about the low place of man, the low place of humanity. The Bible is realistic about humans not being the crowning piece of God's creation that he might or might not have intended them to be. Whether or not God made this all for us, the Bible isn't very clear. But whether or not we are the crowning piece of creation, the Bible is very clear. We're not. We fail to be. So I don't think we should expect, by any means, us to be at the front of creation, everywhere in creation. I don't think we should expect to be given a privileged place. I don't think we should expect glory. That's not what we see, and it's not what the Bible tells us to expect. And so actually, I think what Daniel has highlighted here is actually perfectly consistent with what the biblical picture tells us. I think it's also consistent with what I've said. What I've said is that there's good evidence that God created the universe. Because these things, the universe being this way, the universe having this pale blue dot, whether it's significant or insignificant, the universe being this way, the universe existing at all, the universe existing in a beautiful, regular way, is really unlikely if God doesn't exist, but it's reasonably likely if God does exist. That's the crux of my argument. And I don't think that argument has been significantly undermined tonight. But importantly, Daniel has highlighted the fact that actually humans haven't lived up to what we might have expected given these arguments. And I think that's absolutely right. And so what I really want to finish just by saying is that nothing Daniel has said, in my opinion, has really undermined what I've said, has really undermined the biblical picture of humanity. It's a fairly grim one, it's a fairly dismal one. I hope I've at least managed to some extent to show you the other side of what the Bible says about that, the other side of what Christians have said about that. I talked about some of the evidence for this earlier. I'm going to talk about the evidence for it at a future date in future writings and so on, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. I know there have been events about it. Fortunately, the pale blue dot isn't the end of everything. The pale blue dot highlights lowly stature. It highlights all the indignity that we suffer, and it highlights the suffering, and it highlights the lack of glory that we humans have made for ourselves and perhaps deserve. But fortunately, of course, the Christian message, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, isn't the same as that. The future message is that there is redemption. And I hope that nothing Daniel has said tonight has managed to undermine that. Nothing about the scale of the universe shows that the Christian message is incorrect in this regard. The Christian message says not only are humans small, not only are humans new or recent in the scheme of time, humans are also astray. They've also done the wrong thing and gone the wrong way. But it also says that humans have a savior, that humans have a way to go in the future, and that even though God might have left us in a grand, grand universe with vast quantities of open space, vast quantities of empty time, he hasn't left us without a savior to redeem us from whatever we might think comes wrongly from that, or whatever we might think is a problem from that. He hasn't left us without a savior who will leave us alone in despair because of it. So thank you very much for listening.
Dr. Kalam Miller, thank you all again.